In our headlines on this Tuesday afternoon, March 21st. President Yoon Suk-yeol is poised to join the group of 7 leaders this coming May over in Hiroshima amid an invitation to the summit by his Japanese counterpart, Fumio Kishida. Meanwhile, the leaders of China and Russia reaffirmed their commitment to bilateral ties as President Xi Jinping pledges a plan to end the war in Ukraine, much to the skepticism of the US and its allies. And the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says failure to cut greenhouse gas emissions by about half by 2030 will raise the average global temperature by some 2.8 degrees by 2100. We start with a presidential vote of confidence regarding efforts between Seoul and Tokyo to bridge the historical divide and to enhance bilateral ties. Now, remarks to this end were shared during a live 25-minute televised address earlier on this Tuesday by President Yoon Suk-yeol in response to skepticism over his summit in Tokyo last Thursday. President Yoon also highlighted security concerns over North Korea's rampant brinkmanship and the potential economic gains to be reaped as reasons to rally behind closer cooperation between South Korea and Japan. Beyond diplomacy, he also touched upon the ongoing debate over government plans to expand working hours from the current 52 hours per week. He claimed a final decision will be made after taking into account public opinion and relevant data, acknowledging that working over 60 hours a week may harm health. And in response to related remarks by the leaders of South Korea and Japan, officials here have undertaken protocols to put a bilateral intelligence sharing pact back on track. According to Seoul's foreign ministry on Tuesday, intentions to normalize GSOMIA have been conveyed to relevant authorities in Japan in a written format. Back in the year 2019, Seoul threatened to terminate the pact in retaliation to export restrictions on South Korea by Tokyo. While the pact was not annulled, bilateral ties on the general front were left completely strained. Last Thursday, however, President Yoon Suk-yeol agreed to normalize the pact during talks in Tokyo with Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida amid North Korea's missile and nuclear ambitions. Also, speaking about North Korea, Seoul has slapped new sanctions against Pyongyang in response to the latter's most recent missile provocations. The foreign ministry here has banned 77 items needed to advance North Korea's satellite program, including power supplies, antennas and GPS devices. The ministry has also reportedly shared its list of items with its allies to ensure a unified effort against Pyongyang's reckless ambitions. Meanwhile, 4 individuals and 6 institutions have also been sanctioned for their involvement in North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. As largely expected, President Yoon Suk-yeol has been invited by his Japanese counterpart Fumio Kishida to the Group of 7 summit scheduled for May over in Hiroshima. Our senior top office correspondent Oh Soo-young reports.
President Yoon Suk-yeol's office has welcomed Japan's invitation for South Korea to join the G7 meeting in May, amid anticipation that the two neighbours will discuss strategic cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region. A few hours after Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida announced on Monday he'd asked 8 countries to join the summit in Hiroshima, Seoul's top office spokesperson Yoon said in a written statement Monday this was a positive measure taken as a result of the Yoon-Kishida summit last week. Affirming their will to resolve the historical sticking points that triggered the trade war in 2019. The two leaders at their summit last week agreed to take steps to resume and bolster trade and active diplomacy. Critically, they saw eye to eye on strengthening cooperation in the face of various economic and security challenges, with the South Korean president highlighting the two countries' common values of upholding liberal democracy, the rule of law and market economy. Yoon told Japanese media before his meeting with Kishida that attending the G7 meeting would provide a chance to establish strong solidarity and cooperation with countries that share universal values, mainly in security, economy and trade. The G7 summit is widely expected to focus on the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine and financial instability across the global economy. On the sidelines, the leaders of South Korea, Japan and the United States are likely to meet to discuss North Korea's growing nuclear and missile threat, as well as ways to bolster economic security and technological cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region. In this regard, Japanese media reported that Canada is eager to form a four-country cooperation framework with Seoul, Tokyo and Washington amid geopolitical frictions with China and Russia. Such an informal framework already exists, comprising the US, Japan, India and Australia, known as the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or Quad for short. The Japan Times cited diplomatic sources who said Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau proposed a new Quad to Kishida in January. When questioned about the idea, a South Korean presidential official told reporters they hadn't heard of a new Quad so far, but cooperation in military and economic security is highly likely to be discussed during the G7 summit or Yoon's upcoming summit with US President Joe Biden next month. 오수영, Arirang News.
In Moscow, Russia's Vladimir Putin and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping have reaffirmed their commitment to bilateral ties in a summit that the Chinese leader says seeks an end to the war in Ukraine. The Biden administration, for its part, remains skeptical. Our Ising-jae has the latest.
President Xi Jinping is currently on a three-day visit to Russia. There, the Chinese leader met with Russian President Vladimir Putin on Monday for what Beijing has billed as peace talks as part of Xi's vision to mediate a deal to end the conflict in Ukraine. During the talks, the two leaders touted their close ties amid geopolitical tensions and their shared strategic vision. Calling him a dear friend, Xi showed continued support for Putin amid international condemnation of the ongoing war in Ukraine and the recent issuing of an arrest warrant for the Russian leader by the International Criminal Court. Washington, however, remains skeptical over what they believe to be China's real intentions. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken went as far as to slam Beijing for siding with Moscow, despite the ICC arrest warrant for Putin for alleged war crimes.
That President Xi is traveling to Russia days after the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for President Putin suggests that China feels no responsibility to hold the Kremlin accountable for the atrocities committed in Ukraine, and instead of even condemning them, it would rather provide diplomatic cover for Russia to continue to commit those very crimes.
Both U.S. and European officials are also concerned that China may even add fuel to the war in Ukraine, with Washington still believing that Beijing is open to supplying Russia with artillery shells. Not to mention, Washington also believes that any ceasefire deal brokered by China may be more beneficial to Russia.
But we are concerned that instead, China will reiterate calls for a ceasefire that leaves Russian forces inside Ukraine's sovereign territory. Now, any ceasefire that does not address the removal of Russian forces from Ukraine would effectively ratify Russia's illegal conquests.
U.S. National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby says Xi should also consider Ukraine, with the Chinese leader expected to hold phone talks with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky after his visit to Russia. Ising-jae, Arirang News.
Over in France, President Emmanuel Macron's administration withstood, albeit barely, a vote of no confidence earlier on Monday, paving the path to pension reform that raises the retirement age from 62 to 64, as officially announced last Friday. Our Kim Jung-shil has details.
The voting took place at the French National Assembly on Monday local time. The no-confidence votes were triggered by opposition parties when the French government forced an increase in the pension age by 2 years from the current 62 to 64. The votes had been technically the last resort in order to stop the French government from implementing the hugely unpopular pension reforms.
Here are the results. The absolute majority needed for the no-confidence vote was 287. Those in favor of the motion were 278. Since the number didn't reach the majority, the motion of no confidence was not adopted.
9 votes stopped the first motion of no confidence. The second no-confidence vote was then tabled by Marine Le Pen's right-wing National Rally Party and only managed to get 94 votes in favor, paving the way for Macron's government to pass the pension reform. Since the margin of Macron's victory was so thin, the opposition party said the French government politically has nothing to be rejoicing about.
Yes, this motion of no confidence failed, but it only needed 9 more votes. That's a lot less than what was forecasted by several polls done by political analysts and journalists.
Monday's failed vote sparked fresh protests all over France, with a tense standoff between protesters and police.
I speak for the cleaners. We have a very difficult job. We have workers who wake up very early for 40 years, 5 a.m., even 4 a.m., and finish at 10 p.m. It's tiring. People cannot continue working until 64 years old. It's impossible.
With protests taking place all over the country, President Emmanuel Macron is suffering from his lowest approval rating since the height of the Yellow Vest anti-government protests over fuel taxes in 2018. Kim Jung-sil, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, the United Nations is sounding the alarm yet again over the catastrophic consequences of climate change should we fail to take tangible action over the next decade. Our foreign affairs correspondent Choi Min-jung has more on the latest sobering outlook.
The world is beyond the point where climate change can be somebody else's problem. This is according to the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, also called the IPCC. The body of climate scientists released its 6th assessment report, which included scientific and socio-economic data concerning climate change.
The report offers hope, and it provides a warning. It warns that the pace and scale of what has been done so far and current plans are insufficient to tackle climate change. We are walking when we should be sprinting.
The IPCC said continued greenhouse gas emissions will lead to further global warming, with the best estimate that global temperatures will increase by 1.5 degrees Celsius from the period between 1850 and 1900 early in the next decade. It added that actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions are more urgent than previously assessed, and that the remainder of the current decade is key to securing a sustainable future for all. To limit warming, the IPCC said emissions should be cut by almost half by 2030 across all sectors. If countries were to fail to meet this goal, the average global temperature is forecast to rise by around 2.8 degrees by 2100. The report reiterated previous findings that it is unequivocal that humanity is to blame for climate change. It appealed to increased international cooperation, including improved access to adequate financial resources, particularly for vulnerable regions. It added that shifting to clean energy would not only help combat climate change, but also impact people's health and well-being. The IPCC said the planet has already warmed 1.1 degrees Celsius since the second half of the 19th century, which has caused frequent and more intense extreme weather events around the world. It warns that the world is bound to face ever more disastrous impacts if warming exceeds 1.5 degrees Celsius. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
Back on the local front, pundits are predicting a slight improvement in Korea's exports in the second quarter this year. According to the Korea International Trade Association on Tuesday, the Export Business Survey Index jumped to 90.9 for the April to June period from 81.8 the quarter before. The index has improved for the first time in 4 quarters, but the figure is still well below 100, meaning the overall outlook remains pessimistic. By item, exports of cargo ships, petroleum products and cars are expected to rise from the previous quarter. In contrast, ship exports are expected to drop further amid lower prices and market tensions between the US and China. Staying on the economic front, production prices rose for the second month in a row in February. According to the Bank of Korea on Tuesday, the country's production price index, an indicator of future inflation, went up by 0.1% compared to the previous month. Now, this was led by price increases in services such as dining and lodging, as well as the production of chemical goods and electronic devices. However, prices of electricity and gas dropped by 0.3% in February after jumping 4% in January. A neighborhood here in Seoul has taken it upon itself to address the sad reality of dying alone and going undiscovered for days or even weeks. Now, this tragic phenomenon is known as kodoksa in Korean, or literally lonely death in English, and has become a growing national concern. Our Lee Si-hoo has this report.
Choi Young-myung and Kim Yoon-suk, residents of Bangak-idong in Dobong-gu district in Seoul, are on a special mission. After living in the area for over 30 years, they don't need a map to reach their destination, which is the home of a neighbor who lives alone. The greeting is followed by a check of how the neighbor is doing.
그래도 눈 아프시고 그래도 병원 계속 다니시죠?
네, 약은 계속 침침하고 이쪽은 반밖에 안 보여요. 시력을 잃었어요.
그러니까 그래도 저 알아보시는데요? 알아보시잖아요.
Mrs. Choi and Mrs. Kim are part of an 8-person team in Bangak-idong, which cares for neighbors that live alone. They regularly visit and make phone calls to some 990 neighbors. When the two spot potential risks in their neighbors' lives, they connect them to a social worker who can provide the necessary help. The team also shares necessities such as bedding and food.
The positive thing about this work is easing the loneliness our neighbors feel. We listen to the stories of their difficulties and problems and become sort of like talking buddies.
Since we are neighbors, they sometimes feel they can share more than they would with social workers. We then work with the experts to solve problems, and it creates a more coordinated effect.
Such help is needed now more than ever, with more so-called lonely deaths occurring in South Korea. According to a report from last year, the number of people dying alone has been on the increase in recent years, a phenomenon that the government says has been caused in part by increased urbanization.
The community and voluntary efforts are needed to find these unseen neighbors. While it's important for public officials to monitor regularly, it's also important for other neighbors to check whether the lights go on and off and doors open and close.
What's needed is a community culture.
Most importantly, the community culture needs to be revived. While this can be difficult to achieve in today's competitive and individualistic society, the culture of solidarity and sharing needs to be in place for a long-term solution.
Meanwhile, the South Korean government is set to announce a comprehensive lonely death prevention plan within the first half of the year. Lee Si-hu, Arirang News.
On the entertainment front, Blackpink's Jennie is celebrating a fresh record for online music video views. On Tuesday, the music video for her debut single, Solo, passed 900 million views on YouTube, making her the first female K-pop solo artist to achieve that feat. According to her agency YG Entertainment, the video passed the milestone figure at 12:56 a.m., 4 years and 4 months after it was first released in November 2018. The single follows a woman who fully embraces a single life after a breakup.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. In Somalia, a new report says that the drought there killed tens of thousands of people in 2022. According to a United Nations report, as many as 43,000 people may have died in the Horn of Africa as a result of diseases and malnutrition linked to the drought last year. Released on Monday, the report added that about half the estimated deaths were children under the age of 5. The figures mark the first official death toll from Somalia's current drought crisis. And with an additional 18,000 to 34,000 deaths expected in the first half of 2023, it's likely the death toll from the ongoing drought could exceed that of a previous dry season in 2017 to 2018. The UN says it needs $2.6 billion to respond to Somalia's drought, but only 15% of that has been secured. Turning over to the Ukraine, as the European Union's foreign and defense ministers have agreed to send about 1 million artillery shells to Kyiv over the span of 12 months. The decision to send the 155mm shells was made in Brussels on Monday and will see some European countries send some of their own stockpiles to the war-torn country. Some will also joint purchase $2.1 million of additional ammunition.
A portion of the purchased ammunition will be used to replenish the EU's own supply. The United States has also pledged further military aid with $350 million worth of ammunition and military equipment. The support comes after Kyiv said that its forces needed to ration its ammunition amid supply shortages. The world may not be all gloom and doom, at least according to the 2023 World Happiness Index. Released on the International Day of Happiness, March 20th, the index claims that the world is happier than before the COVID-19 pandemic. This is because acts of kindness counterbalanced misery factors. It's the 10th report of its kind, with 100,000 people across 137 countries taking part. Participants were asked to evaluate their lives on a scale of 1 to 10. Finland claimed the title of World's Happiest Nation as it ranked number 1 for the 6th straight year. It was followed by Denmark and Iceland, with South Korea ranked at 57th. And finally, Rupert Murdoch is set to tie the knot for the 5th time at the age of 92. The billionaire media mogul proposed to his partner, 66-year-old Anne Leslie Smith, on St. Patrick's Day. The couple met in September last year at an event hosted at one of Murdoch's California-based properties. During an interview with his own publication, The New York Post, on Monday, Murdoch said that this marriage will be his last. The couple intend to get married this summer. Murdoch has 6 children from his previous marriages and is the owner of media powerhouse News Corporation, which controls media brands such as Fox News. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good afternoon. It's the spring equinox today, already the 4th spring season term on the traditional calendar. And right on cue, spring warms is in full swing nationwide, a chilly start turning to much warmer highs. Air quality has improved compared to yesterday, but still, dust is lingering in the air, especially in western parts of the country where dust levels were very bad yesterday. The air quality will be poor all day today. A dry weather advisory remains in effect in most parts, while Jeju Island is seeing rainfall, and it will be rainy through tomorrow with up to 30 millimeters of rainfall expected there. It feels more like the end of April than late March today, with some of the southern regions seeing highs nearing 25 degrees Celsius this afternoon. The warming trend hit its peak tomorrow with an expected high of 24 degrees in the capital. Southern provinces will see rain from tomorrow into early Thursday. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
That ends our afternoon newscast, but do stay with us for our panel session coming up right after this break. See you in a bit.